Hey guys, welcome to a new series I'm starting called Music and Makeup. I have been in music for 24 years and makeup for 24 years, so I thought I'd merge them together and do this. Make sure to like, comment, share, subscribe if you enjoy it. And yeah, let's get into it. So I've got my brows on and I got my eye base on. David Bowie. David Robert Jones was born on January 6th, 1947 in Brixton, South London. He was born to a working class family, mother Peggy and dad Haywood. Peggy was a waitress at a cinema, which I did not know was a thing. And Haywood was a public relations manager for an orphanage. And it's the 40s, so their relationship would kind of be considered unconventional because they were not married. And so having a baby out of wedlock was kind of frowned upon. But they did get married 6 months after David was born. He had some siblings, but he bonded mostly with his brother Terry, who was his half-brother. He was older than David, and David really, really looked up to him. He absolutely idolized Terry. By age 6, he was already being called gifted. He made friends quickly. They said he was a neat little boy, as in neat, like he always dressed really cute, really nice, very handsome. When David was 9, his best friend and brother Terry enlisted in the Royal Air Force, and that year the family moved to Bromley. And when he moved to Bromley in music class, his teacher described his voice as adequate. At the age of 9, his dancing during the newly introduced music and movements classes was described as striking and imaginative, and teachers called his interpretations vividly artistic. They said he had quite a lot of poise for someone his age. That same year, his interests in music were further stimulated when his father brought home a collection of American 45s. And he brought him home some records by the Platters, Fats Domino, Elvis Presley, and Little Richard. And upon hearing Little Richard's Tutti Frutti, he would later say that he heard God in that album. And he also said in an interview that his 8-year-old self wanted to be a white Little Richard, or at least his saxophone player. So Little Richard made a huge impact on him. And he was especially impressed with Elvis. And fun fact, David Bowie and Elvis have the same birthday. And he would perform all around his hometown. So having encouraged his son to follow his dreams of being an entertainer and a musician, Haywood would take him to see a lot of his favorite singers and other musicians. And he started preparing for the Royal Variety performance. After taking his 11 plus exam at the conclusion of his Burnt Ash Junior education, Bowie went on in 1958 to Bromley Technical School. Now, when Terry was living with Bowie, he would take him to see many of Terry's own lifelong influences. And he was into a lot of modern jazz and all the beat poets, Buddhism. Terry himself had a lot of artistic influences, the occult. He would take David on his first trip to London to the Soho district, and it was very bohemian and where all those kind of people hung out, all the artistic types, all the free spirits. And before long, David took up guitar and saxophone, He said he wanted to be a musician because, in his words, it seemed rebellious and subversive. This is also when he started experimenting with his look and with clothing. Also during this time, he and his best friend got in a fist fight over a girl. This was his childhood best friend, and his friend didn't mean to hurt him. You know, it was just one of those thoughtless, erratic boy moments. He hit David in the eye, and the blow really hurt him, and it damaged his eye. So he was rushed to the hospital, and they thought he might lose the eye, but they were able to save it. It took like 3 operations, and it left his eye. It left the pupil of his eye permanently dilated, so it always looked like... A lot of people think David Bowie had 2 different colored eyes, but he didn't. One of his eyes, the pupil, was just permanently, completely dilated. What is happening with his eye? Speaking of eyes. But in hindsight, David wasn't even mad about it. And he kind of thought he liked looking a little different, so he kind of thought it gave him a unique look. But he was out of school for 3 months for that. Well, they did all the surgeries to try to save his eye. So while he was out, he just threw himself deeper and deeper into music. And he loved rock and roll. But he also loved show tunes. And he said that when he was a teen, he wanted to write musicals. And he also had a propensity for the costuming and for the unique clothes. So David began to perform in bands, and his first band was a pop cover band called the Conrads. That lasted about a year, and that was with his friend George, the same one who he got in the fight with, and they formed an R&B group called the King Bees. And at that point, he was still calling himself Davy Jones. So remember, that's his name, David Jones. This was before the Monkees. So they cut a single, but they broke up soon after. He started another band called the Manish Boys, which got more traction, but they eventually broke up too. And in 1965, he formed his 4th rock band called the Lower Third. And at the time, that's when Davy Jones of the Monkees had started getting popular. And so he thought it was time to change his name. And since he loved all things American, he saw a picture of Jim Bowie, which was like a frontiersman. And he had like this picture with a Bowie knife. And in September of 1965... the 18-year-old changed his name to David Bowie. So by 1966, the whole London scene was popping with all these British bands. So there were the Who, the Yardbirds, the Beatles. Bowie released his first solo album. It was called Do Anything You Say, and while it didn't chart, it did get him a manager, finally. So he signed with Ken Pick, and Ken Pick was kind of an icon. He managed Judy Garland, Frank Sinatra, Duke Ellington. I mean, he was kind of a big deal. And it was Ken who suggested that Bowie put together like a cabaret act, doing some standards and show tunes. And he liked the idea, but he really wanted to do his own thing. So around this time, David's brother Terry had began exhibiting signs of schizophrenia. Now this was something that David was worried about because it ran in his mother's family. He had an aunt who had had a lobotomy. He had family members who had been institutionalized. So this was always something that was like in the back of his mind that he worried about. He had also started using drugs, which if anyone knows, it makes it a lot worse. Makes the symptoms worse. So not long after this, Terry was also institutionalized. David just began to worry what this would mean for him if he would kind of eventually suffer the same fate. And it's also said that this would be a major influence on the music that David would make, and especially in his early years. So in 1966, in September, his manager got him a deal with Derm Records, and it was a bright spot and an otherwise really scary time for him. His father, of course, was super excited for him and proud that things were finally starting to happen. Now, the album didn't do too well, but his manager encouraged him to also get into acting, and that was always a passion of his too. In 1967, he was cast in a short film called The Image, and you can still find it online. It's pretty cool, but that's where he really fell in love with acting. And in that fall, he began to study with performance artists Lindsay Kemp, who was taught by the mime Marcel Marceau. Lindsay taught him everything he knew: costuming, makeup, just movement. And while working with him, he met Hermione Farthingale. I love that name. And she was a dancer, and he instantly fell in love with her, and they soon moved in together. And in the summer of '68, he teamed up with her and John Hutchinson and begun to form a group called Feathers. There was singing, there was dancing, there was poetry, and they began to perform around London. And shortly after, their manager financed a short promo video for them to showcase all this stuff. But during production, Hermione broke things off and broke his heart. And he was devastated, but he just tried to focus on the music and keep going. And in '69, he organized a performance workshop that they would run out of a local pub. And it was like a showcase where other artists could come and perform their original stuff. It was during this time that he saw the movie 2001 Space Odyssey, and he was inspired to compose Space Oddity. And it was a tale about the astronaut Major Tom that we all know and love, who was lost in space. And the release coincided in July of '69, just days before the moon landing. So it was used all over media the weeks that Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. And this, of course, thrilled him to no end. But in the US, it received almost no airplay. Soon, a new woman would distract David. Her name was Angie Barnett, and she was an aspiring singer. Iggy Pop stated and described her as an over-the-top American girl. And of course, we know David loved all things American. And they had a unique relationship. It was an open relationship, but soon they moved in together. So he and Angie had moved in together, and they had gone on a trip to Malta to an International Songwriters Award competition, what have you. And a song from his first album was actually nominated for Best Produced Album, and it won. But the excitement was short-lived, as shortly after they got back, David's father, Haywood, would pass away from pneumonia. So David stepped in, and like the good son that he was, and he handled all the arrangements and took care of his family. And as he was grieving the loss of his father, Space Oddity picked up momentum again. It was kind of unexpected, and it reached number 5 on the British charts. So he tried to build on the success and released another album, but the sales just weren't there. So in '69, he and Angie rented this 30-room mansion in London and invited several friends to live with them, and they created like just this hub of creativity. It was very boho and just a very hippie thing to do back then. So they began staying in this mansion with their friends and writing and playing music. So fast forward to a few months later. It's 1970. Janice and Jimmy have died. Joplin and Hendrix. The Beatles had broken up, and drug use had become kind of the norm back then, and he was experimenting a lot. He was especially fond of Lou Reed, who incidentally wrote a lot about drugs, among other things, that pushed social norms. But he also really admired Andy Warhol and Iggy Pop. And I'll mention Iggy Pop a few times in this video because they actually became very, very good friends. But Bowie was interested in anyone who was kind of pushing against social norms. That was just his thing. So in the spring of 1970, he created a new band called The Hype. This was with Mike Garrison, John Cambridge, and Tony Visconti. David performed as Rainbow Man, and he found, this is where David figured out that if he performed as a fictional character, he just had a freedom that he didn't have before when trying to perform on stage. He said in an interview that he was not a natural performer and that he was not at all at ease on stage. But audiences did not receive it very well. They would yell things, homophobic slurs at the guys. But you know, they were not interested in at all playing it safe. They were there to push boundaries. But 1 month later, he actually did something very conventional when he proposed to Angie. However, they maintained an open relationship. So as one chapter closed, another one started when he ended his professional career with his manager. The psychedelic era had kind of begun, and Ken just didn't know what to do with Bowie and his new vision. But David knew exactly what he was doing. So David signed with a new manager, Tony DeFries, and it was Angie who actually encouraged David to try this new, more androgynous look. She encouraged him to wear dresses, which back then was extremely, extremely taboo. It's that look that caused people to notice him. But they seemed to be more interested in his sexuality than his music. One journalist said he looked more like Lauren Bacall than a rock star. He just laughed them off, as he would often do and would continue to do in the future. And he surprised them all when he and Angie welcomed a son in May of 1971. His name was Zoe Bowie. Is that not the cutest thing you've ever heard? So David was thrilled to be a daddy, but just, weeks after Zoe was born, he traveled to America and signed a lucrative record deal with RCA Records. And the first album was Hunky Dory, which featured one of my favorite songs, Changes, and my now grown daughters know that song from the Shrek soundtrack. But it was David Bowie first. Not long after, in an interview with Melody Maker, and for those that don't know, Melody Maker is kind of like a trade publication, but he would come out as being gay, and of course there was huge outrage in Britain, in the British press, and it's debatable whether it was calculated or not, the timing of it with the record release, but either way, he kind of played into it and used it to his advantage. Sorry, I'm trying to get this cut crease straight. But whether it was calculated or not, it took David's career to a whole nother level. And the song Changes would seem very appropriate for everything that would follow. So in 1972, Jesus Christ Superstar was sweeping Broadway, and 26-year-old Bowie fused all of the influences of his past and current day to create a new stage persona. And this would be the famous Ziggy Stardust. These cut creases are sisters. They are not twins, but we're just gonna go with it. Oof. So an American singer named Vince Taylor was the inspiration for Ziggy. And David was quoted as saying that this guy was totally, in his words, totally flipped. He said he was not playing with a full deck. Taylor thought, this is why. Taylor thought he had a connection between himself, UFOs, and Jesus Christ. And you start talking like that, and people are going to think certain things about you. So during one of his concerts, Taylor announced that he was in fact Jesus Christ. And what are you boofing at, sir? Bowie's boofing. What are you boofing at? So yeah, during one of his concerts, he declared he was Jesus. And, you know, that was the end of that. Bowie said his story was an essential ingredient of Ziggy. And Ziggy's band was named the Spiders from Mars. Sir, you're interrupting. And that was with Mike Garrison again. This time, Trevor Bolder and Mick Woodlinsey. So their whole thing obviously shocked conservatives, as most rock bands did back then. But this was something new. I mean, they were groundbreaking. Young people just absolutely fell in love with it. And on June 9th, 1972, the rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust hits doors and became David's, first official breakout record. And it went gold soon after. Now, David had complete dedication to the role of Ziggy. He said, I'm an actor, and when I play a role, I play my part, and I play it all the way through. So, I mean, he rarely broke character. And it is argued that he single-handedly ushered in the era of glam rock. I don't think a lot of people would argue that, though. So his outrageousness just kept, fueling rumors and opinions about him. But it kept people talking. And Bowie went ahead and played into that. And with Bowie as his manager's kind of main man, he started a management company called Main Man Management. Now you're going to want to pay attention to the main man management part because it's going to come back later. David also gained popularity for songs that he wrote for other people. Walk on the Wild Side, he wrote for Lou Reed, All the Young Dudes. There were several that he wrote for other people that did very well for him. And in December of 72, Ziggy finally hit America. He wasn't a huge success yet in the US, but DeFreeze thought if you spend money like you're a big deal, people will think you're a big deal. And that's just kind of how that went down at first. But unfortunately, more money was going out than coming in. I mean, they had people laundering their underwear, like dry cleaning their underwear. They were staying at the plaza. They were flexing hard. Tony had actually been getting advances from RCA to pay for all this. Little did they know. But back home, Angie was turning into a bit of a Yoko Ono, if you know what I mean. She wanted to be more in charge of the management. She didn't handle it real well when his career went to another level. So while Ziggy was a success, the show was a financial failure. But even so, when he returned to Britain, he came home a hero. But little did they know that their hero was Bowie. He also came home with a propensity for cocaine. And after America, it got really bad with him indulging. And his addiction and stress caused him to lose a ton of weight. And all that he went through gave rise to his new album, Aladdin Sane. It's spelled Aladdin Sane. Aladdin Sane, get it? And it was really a reflection of what he was going through. So to promote the new album, he embarked on a 100-day tour. And he finally got to play Radio City Music Hall. Ugh. So during one of the shows, he was performing, ironically enough, Rock and Roll Suicide, and he collapsed on the stage. And he was out for a while. But in spite of the incident, I guess the show must go on. So it did. So after the US leg of the tour, the band headed to Japan and then Russia and then back to England. And when he got to England, he learned that Aladdin Sane was #1. This should have made him happy, but he realized that he had lost his way. He had created an alter ego, and he felt the fanfare was not really for him, but was for the alter ego he created. Not Davy Jones from Bromley. It was for, David Bowie, for Ziggy Stardust. So the alter ego had now kind of stopped. He continued to play sold out shows. But on the last song of the last show, he announced at the end that after a year and a half of playing Ziggy, he was retiring, and he decided to retire the character that had brought him all the fame. Now Ziggy was gone, but not forgotten. He inspired bands like Queen, which thank God for that, and was even the inspiration for the glam rock musical that opened in 1973, Rocky Horror Picture Show. In July of 73, Bowie had 5 albums in the top 40 and 3 in the top 15. This was unprecedented for a solo artist, and the retirement didn't last long. In reality, he just retired Ziggy. He didn't retire. But David released Pin-Ups, which was a tribute to his favorite British rock bands of the 60s. And he also set out to make a rock musical based on George Orwell's 1984. 21 songs were written, all to find out he could not secure the rights to the book. So he incorporates the music on his next album, Diamond Dogs, and Rebel Rebel, another one of my favorites, was the first single. And fun fact about that, he plays every instrument, including the guitar riff on Rebel Rebel. And he continued to be a rebel in his personal life. Though he was still married to Angie, he started a serious relationship with Ava Cherry, a singer he had met while touring. And at first, Angie was fine with it. They had always had an open relationship. But when Cherry and Bowie moved in together in New York, her feelings kind of changed her tune a little bit, And he began planning the tour for Diamond Dogs. At the height of the tour, though, his cocaine habit had him down to like 95 pounds. He was 5'10", so he was not an exceptionally short guy, but he was not doing good. So as he's planning for the Diamond Dogs tour, he envisioned this like elaborate stage combining music and miming and dance. And he wanted performance artist Tony Basil to choreograph the show. Do y'all remember Tony Basil? I know you do. Well, maybe not some of you. I'm old. Oh, Mickey, you're so fine, you blow my mind. That's Tony Basil. She did the Mickey song. I think that was the only hit she had. Do you know she's 77 now? I feel so old. So this was really turning out to be a very expensive tour, and it was unlike any production audiences had ever seen. The theatrics were amazing, but Bowie was always more interested in the art than he was making money. And you have to respect that to some degree. When Tony DeFries, his manager, found out how much it was costing, he lost his crap and he canceled the London dates. And he and Tony had a, what we call in the South, the come to Jesus meeting. And he was shocked to learn that most of his money had been used to pay back RCA for the ongoing advances they had made to the tours all these years, and there was nothing left. And David thought he was partners with DeFries in main man management and thought they would be sharing in the profits, since it was basically built on Bowie's career. But Tony was like, "No man, this is my gig." So Bowie had been so deep into the art of it that he didn't realize he was getting screwed. And it was a huge, huge slap in the face. And at the age of 27, he was flat broke again. But he learned a valuable lesson. And even though he wasn't interested in the financial aspect of things, he learned that he was going to have to be. He couldn't play it fast and loose and see how things shake out. That wasn't going to work. So he scaled back production on Diamond Dogs and kept on working. But there was one area that was costing him a small fortune, and that was that little cocaine habit. It was not so little. And it said that at this time his diet consisted of literally milk and cocaine. And that's obviously what was keeping him underweight and constantly paranoid and sick. But even in his addiction, he continued to work on his next album, and he would delve into his childhood passion of rhythm and blues. And soul music had an enormous impact on his life and on his music. And his backup singers for the new album, Young Americans, were some of the best. Robin Clark was one. His girlfriend Ava Cherry, and the legend in his own right, Luther Vandross. He called his new music Plastic Soul. And Robin Clark said that the name came out of his own sense of humor, like, "Hey, look at me, I'm a white boy, but I got soul." He recorded most of the songs for Young American in like a week. And it was that part was most definitely fueled by the cocaine use. He never slept. He just stayed up making music. And if you watch old video clips of this time, you can definitely see signs of his addiction. On the album, he also collaborated with guitarist Carlos Alomar and John Lennon for Fame. This song was very much autobiographical, and the illusions of Fame and his plight with Tony, his old manager, and how he got played. Lennon actually counseled him, John Lennon of the Beatles, on what to do about Tony. So he followed Lennon's advice, and he actually got out of his contract with DeFries, and Fame became David Bowie's first #1 in America and made him a bona fide rock star. So in 75, Bowie moved to LA, but that is when his addiction caused him to really lose it. Like, he described that as like the worst time in his life. He said it was, he got into a lot of trouble emotionally and spiritually, and he told the story of how he literally woke up in a gutter one morning, and he said to himself, I'm gonna die. I gotta do something about this. So in June of that year, he took a break, and an acting opportunity came along. Director Nicholas Roeg was casting the part of an extraterrestrial who fell to Earth. And it was a movie about an alien trying to save his drought-stricken planet, and he agreed to abstain from drugs while he was filming because he had obtained quite the reputation at this point. And it was a modest box office draw, but it did garner him some critical acclaim. In 1976, he released his next album, which was Station to Station, and we were introduced to another side of David Bowie, the elegant thin white Duke, as he was called. It was a far cry from Ziggy Stardust, but he wore long, tailored white suits. This album became his highest charting album since Diamond Dogs, and this included the singles Golden Years. Have y'all ever seen A Knight's Tale? It's my favorite scene in the movie is when they dance to Golden Years. It's an underrated film. Revenue from the LP and from his greatest hits album, Changes One, finally put him back on financial solid ground. He finally had recovered. At this time he moved Angie and son Zoe to a beautiful home in Switzerland. And he kind of did this so that his earnings could be sheltered from taxes. So he knew what was up. But David and Angie would never again live as husband and wife. And a few months later, he set out and took a small apartment in Berlin. And it was there he really finally, for once and for all, tried to kick his cocaine habit. He was living over in an auto parts store with no central heating, so literally everything went back to basics. While he was in Berlin, he produced The Idiot. He did some really, really creative work on that album, and it's credited as Iggy Pop and his band, but Iggy said that it was just mostly David playing everything. In 76, as disco was being embraced, David was just trying to stay clean and sober. And he was also determined to get back to the art forms that he loved, remain true to that. So while he was in Berlin, he was trying to reinvent himself once again and searching for a new sound. And this is when he released the album Low. And this was really, really experimental. It was something like pop had never really seen before, but it also stumped fans and the music industry. They didn't quite know how to feel about it or what to do with it, and it sold poorly, but that never did and never would stop David from making music that he wanted to make. He created art whether it was popular or not. The following two LPs were Ledger and Heroes. And the title song of Heroes actually became a huge hit. That's another one of my favorites. It was also at this time that David began to delve back into his lifelong love of painting. And Iggy Pop said he was never not doing something creative, whether it was painting, acting, singing, dancing, something creative. And he just always was thinking it in that way. And in December of 1977, the now 30-year-old shocked everyone again when he appeared with Bing Crosby, of all people. And it was on a family Christmas special on CBS. And Bowie had never been seen as family friendly, ever. And speaking of family, at that point, things had kind of reached their breaking point with Angie. Things had become really toxic, and David didn't want to expose Zoe to that. So over the Christmas holiday, David took Zoe back to Berlin, and Angie went to visit family in the US. But when she returned to Switzerland on January 2nd, she was upset that the boys hadn't returned yet. So angry and depressed, Angie attempted suicide. And Bowie was obviously worried about her, but also worried about her ability to care for Zoe. So in 1980, they finally got a divorce. And in the settlement, David was awarded sole custody of Zoe, who now preferred to be called Joe. So we will call him by his preferred vernacular. David had become everything to his son, and he decided to truly kick his addiction. And there's a difference between not using and being sober. And I think he was ready to finally just, you know, kick it for good. Like really, really address it and get rid of it. He just didn't want Joe to grow up around that. So in the fall of 1980, David and Joe moved to New York, and he started in The Elephant Man on Broadway. And he starred as the lead, John Merrick, and even like the toughest Broadway critics gave him just high praises. They said he was just amazing. So he got rave reviews, and during his Broadway run, he released his 17th album, Scary Monsters and Super Creeps, which included the single Ashes to Ashes, a nod to his addiction and reference to Major Tom from Space Oddity. If you have a chance, check out the video for that. It's very poignant. Industry pros allude that David's music video contributions were the most influential, because this is when music videos were just becoming popular, and David kind of saw it as like filmmaking. In 1980, one of David's dearest friends, John Lennon, we talked about earlier, was shot and killed by a deranged fan, and he was devastated. Friend and backup singer Robin said that he was completely broken. It was like he lost a brother. So a number of weeks later, when his Broadway run ended, he left New York and returned to Switzerland, where he mourned the loss of John. In 1982, David threw himself back into acting and starred in The Hunger with Susan Sarandon. But right before the movie release, he received the heartbreaking news that his brother Terry had jumped from a window in an attempted suicide. Terry survived, but Bowie was like, I'm out. And he went back to England to see him. His colleagues stated that David didn't talk personally about his family, and it was just all very secretive. But back then, they didn't really talk about mental health like we do, or like we are starting to do these days. In 1983, David starred in a World War II drama, Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. And it was a story about a soldier who believed he let his brother down. So it was very personal to him, and he really tapped into his own relationship with Terry for this role. And while the movie received mixed reviews, his performance didn't. His acting was said by critics to be the highlight of the film. So after the film, he was ready, and he got the situation with Terry, you know, kind of back to a normal pace. He was ready to focus on music again. This time, he would take everyone by surprise by doing the thing he had never done before, which was embracing mainstream music. And by 1983, music videos had kind of taken over. And that year, at 36 years old, David signed a 5-year contract with EMI Records, and Let's Dance became one of the videos on more heavier rotations on MTV, and it was an overnight sensation. Music videos made him a star for the next generation. So we had all these people that grew up with Ziggy, and now we've got a new generation, the MTV generation, my generation, who, you know, were discovering him. Let's Dance went platinum just 8 weeks after its release. The LP produced 2 other hits, China Girl and Modern Love. Producer Nile Rodgers said for the first time, Bowie was acceptable. Socially acceptable. And he had always been so far ahead of his time, but now he seemed to be in sync with pop culture, so his music was more accessible. If you hear my dogs fighting, it just is what it is. They're not really fighting, they're play fighting. But now his music had a more wider appeal, so people who had never listened to him before bought records. And yes, records, this is before CDs and cassettes. The tour for Let's Dance was seen by more than 2.5 million people. He did a charity concert at his last show of the tour to benefit the multiracial community of Brixton, where he had grown up. And just as a side note, if you ever get the opportunity, David was influenced by so many musicians of color. He did an interview back in the 80s with MTV where he was calling them out and saying, I noticed that you don't feature black musicians during your primetime play rotation. Why is that? And it's an awesome interview because the guy, the VJ, is incredibly uncomfortable as he's calling them out for being, you know, prejudiced and racist against black musicians. It's pretty awesome. I'll try to link it. I'll try to remember to link it in the description, but I was watching it thinking, so even socially, you know, he just kind of did things differently. So in 1984, he sat on top of the charts with Miss Tina Turner and Phil Collins and Michael Jackson. And in the fall of that year, he released the album Tonight. It got really bad reviews for being what they call creatively bankrupt. Dog hair. Creatively bankrupt, in their words. Bowie said he learned the way to make money was giving people what they wanted. So he gave them what they wanted. But what does that say about the masses' tastes? Does that mean that the masses like things that are creatively bankrupt? Something to think about. I guess we like creatively bankrupt music. But to be fair, yes, 80s music was just more feel-good than anything else. In January of 1985, David got the terrible news that his brother Terry had committed suicide. He had tried, you know, before. Unfortunately, had never succeeded, but this time it was a little different, and he finally passed away. And of course, he was absolutely overwhelmed. He didn't really share with friends what happened, and they didn't want to cause him, you know, any stress by bringing it up. But later that year, he found something to throw himself into, which seemed to help, and that was Live Aid. And Live Aid highlighted and raised money for starving people in Africa. I remember watching Live Aid concert when I was little. So he performed at Live Aid at Wembley Stadium, and 1.5 billion people watched it or heard it on the radio. I was 9, and I was one of them, for sure. Later that year, he and friend Mick Jagger released Dancing in the Streets, and it went to #1, and all the profits from that went to Live Aid. And in 86, once again, he returned to acting, and he starred in the movie musical Absolute Beginners, and possibly his most iconic role as Jareth, the Goblin King in The Labyrinth. And I will put up a little picture of the Halloween makeup I did as Jareth. It's not as good as Pompberry's, but I tried. I'll put Pompberry's channel in. You have to see hers. It's amazing. But can you believe that Labyrinth failed at the box office? It was not a success. It's only now it's a success. But it was not back then. So in 87, David released Never Let Me Down and went on the Glass Spider tour. But it was such a spectacle and described as Vegas-y that people didn't like it. And thus his love affair with the mainstream was coming to an end. He said it just kind of dried him up artistically. He wasn't used to doing that. And he said, what I'm used to being is stubborn, obscure, confrontational, and in my own way indulgent, and enjoying every second of it. So he went back. Sorry, I'm trying something new. It's the Natasha Denona Diamond and Blush. So in 88, David put together a new act called Tin Machine, which was a heavier rock sound. And people didn't know if it was a joke or what, but it fulfilled something for him. And, you know, he found fulfillment in it. Something he didn't have in his personal life, so it was important in his musical life. He was just out there being a single dad and a rock star, and for 2 years, he dated an American ballet dancer named Melissa Hurley, but ultimately he was 42, she was 22, and they just grew apart. I mean, do you guys think an age gap matters? I have my own personal thoughts and opinions. But in 92, he was introduced to Iman, the amazingly beautiful, stunning, statuesque Iman, and he was smitten. And Iman says that he claims he knew immediately, but she said it took her a couple weeks. But after just 6 months, he proposed. She said he courted her very old fashionably, which is something people don't expect from him. She said he was truly a gentleman. And later that year, they were married, first in a civil ceremony, then in Italy. And his 22-year-old son, Joe, was his best man. And Iman said, "David swept me off my feet, and I'm still off my feet. He has the ability to cause my heart to flutter even still." That's so sweet. So in '93, David released Black Tie, White Noise. It included a song called Jump They Say, and it was a song about Terry's suicide. And it had been almost 7 years since Terry died. It had just kind of taken David that long for him to come to terms with his death and be able to write about it. In 1994, he was making waves in the fine art community. He was appointed to the editorial board of Modern Painters magazine, a very highly regarded publication in the art world. And that year, Bowie was invited to play on MTV's Unplugged, but he wanted to play new material, which didn't fit the format, so he declined. So the world is deprived of that. So David chose to put art first on his next album, and Nile Rodgers said that he had what he liked to call Bowieisms. One was, "If you come from art, you'll always be art." He released Outside, a concept album about art and murder. And when David made an album, of course, he made a character. And every song was kind of like a little play. So he's the playwright as well as the actor. So when it came time to tour, he recruited Trent Reznor and his industrial rock band 9 Inch Nails. Trent said his fearlessness was inspiring to be around. Y'all, get you some friends like David Bowie. David knew it would not be a commercial success, but they were happy with what they created, and I think that's all that matters. So David took another chance with the album Earthling, and he scored a British hit with the song Little Wonder. And in 1996, he was finally inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But after 4 decades of music, this is not working. He had no intention of slowing down whatsoever. So at the age of 53, David became a daddy again. He and Iman welcomed little Alexandria, which is my daughter's name, one of them. Alexandria quickly became the center of his whole entire life. And he said that he owed all these years of happiness to being clean and sober. In 2002, he released Heathen and renewed his contract with Columbia Records. In the fall, he released The Best of Bowie. And at 55 years old, he headlined the Area 2 tour. He was joined by Busta Rhymes and Moby. And soon after, a digitally remastered version of Ziggy Stardust was released as a 20-year anniversary edition. And along with that was a video of Ziggy's last performance. Then in 2006, he starred in one of my favorite movies, The Prestige. If you haven't seen it, it's amazing. And he plays inventor Nikola Tesla. Over the years, lots of bands have credited Bowie. I just touched my face. Great. Have credited Bowie's body of work as influences. REM, U2, as well as a litany of others. And he just paved the way for so many, musically, stylistically, and just in his capacity to always be eager to experiment. I mean, he constantly persevered in his need to evolve and change with the times. Change was kind of defined his life. It was never the same, and his music was never the same. And I think that's why David Bowie has stood the test of time. David said, "What I do is very simple. It's just that my choices are very different from most other people's choices." I'm going to put on my liner and lashes, and I'll be right back. It's hard to talk and do lip liner. He was an icon of innovation and an icon that changed music forever. One music historian said it best. He did more than change the rules. He set the stage for a world where there was no rules. I will finish up the look and come back and talk to you guys. So I thought I'd keep the hair a little Bowie-esque. So David was diagnosed with liver cancer in 2014. He only told family and friends. Nobody really knew about it. He's working on an off-Broadway show that he wrote called Lazarus. And he told some of the people he was working on the show with, but not many people. Even people he worked with like his whole life, he didn't even tell them until some of them he never told them, and others till the very end. He just kept that part of his life private. He was working on an album, Black Star, which some of the songs from Lazarus are on that album. And by mid-2015, they were hoping that the cancer had gone into remission, but it had not. It had spread, and in November of 2015, he was in the middle of filming Lazarus, and they made the decision to end treatment, because he was told it was terminal. His last public appearance before his death was December 7th, and it was at the opening night of his musical, Lazarus, and it was his 69th birthday. And he reportedly wrote a 5-year letter describing what he wanted done with his music after he died. He finally passed away on January 10th, 2016. His official Facebook page posted the message, "David Bowie died peacefully today, surrounded by his family, after a courageous 18-month battle with cancer. While many of you will share in this loss, we ask that you respect the family's privacy during the time of their grief." On the 12th of January 2016, in accordance with David's will, he was cremated in New Jersey, and his ashes were scattered in accordance with Buddhist rituals in Bali, Indonesia. He had vacationed in Bali in the 80s and had written the song Tumble and Twirl about his exploits there. For Easter, my sweet daughter got me this book. It's amazing. It goes into a lot more. I mean, I could have made just hours and hours of stories, but I had to make it somewhat manageable. But I did want to read something, so I thought I'd end it with some of David's words, and this was the final page in this book. If you are interested in it, it's Bowie album by album. It's an awesome book. I'll put it up on my shelf. It says, "Music has given me over 40 years of extraordinary experiences. I can't say that life's pains or more tragic episodes have been diminished because of it, but it's allowed me so many moments of companionship when I've been lonely, and a sublime means of communication when I wanted to touch people. It's been both my doorway of perception and the house that I live in." I hope you guys enjoyed this, and if you have any suggestions, let me know. I will see you next time. Bye, y'all.